right, what's up, everybody? This is kind of a surprise stream. So, welcome. Today, I will be continuing the quest of reviewing every single video on meta ethics on all of YouTube, and we're going to hit up the podcasts. We're gonna go through books and articles. I'm going to review all content ever produced on meta ethics, all of it. And then, when I'm finished that, I'm going to review the content that I just finished. So, it's an infinite amount of content. It never ends. All right, great. We have some of our regulars here. We've got Sapir for 1,000 land salute. We've got Mason for 500, and we've got JRB Gord for 250. And what's up, Harmonica Luke? So this is a video that came out about a week ago. It's a relatively small channel. I put a link in the description, so go give them a subscription, like the videos and all that stuff. Just because I critique a video doesn't mean that we can't be respectful and kind towards our colleagues. So go check them out, give them some love, throw some comments in the comment section over there, even if it's to disagree and criticize. Let's see. I didn't check if there were comments. There's a few comments there. Oh wow, lots of people showing up. This is great. Cool. What's up, everybody? Okay, so let's get straight into the video. Oh, let me check get all the settings set up in advance. And I'm only going to have about 1 hour. I have a little bit more than an hour. So we'll see how it goes. And this is a video on the moral argument, which I think is a terrible argument, mostly because I don't think there's any good reason to accept any premise like that tries to establish the truth of moral realism. But then there's also this notion that you can't have moral realism without God, and I don't see any particular reason to believe that that is true either. The problem is that the way that it's set up, you can't reject both premises at the same time, just because logic works in funky ways. Okay, let's say hi to everybody else, then we'll get into the video. We've got worst cure for insomnia ever. I'll take that as an indication that I'm not going to put you to sleep. So that's good. We got Cloud of Time. How's it going? We got Nitty. What up? Yeah, it's for lunch. I already had lunch, so I'm good. Let me check on one other thing before we get started. Yeah, it's not happening. Okay. Nitty says, name dropped you when I was talking last night. Talking to who? What are you talking about? Cody says, first time here, excited. Very cool. How did you find the channel? You don't know how to @ people. You do @ and then you start writing their name in, and it should allow you to do that. All right. Yeah, Sapir says, Lance, you said that we have to keep track of our land salute on our own. As far as I could tell, there's no oversight, and it turns out I have something like 100 billion land salute at least. We've got Sully saying, sup Lance, how's it going? All right. And Nitty says, one of my viewers likes your content because I sent them your way. Very cool. All right. So let's get into the video. Give me 1 second to get past something. It's gonna go. Okay, there we go. I didn't hear any sound though. Well, whatever. We'll figure it out as it goes. It's very low. Settings. Okay, good. Yeah, the volume sounds good for me. But you haven't seen it yet. 1 moment. I'm almost ready. There we go. All right. Let's get going. Oh, that's very nice of you, Mason. Thanks for giving your land salute to Cody. All right, let's get started.
Now, earlier, I said that the teleological argument is one of my favorite arguments for the existence of God. And I said this because I think it shows with almost near certainty that God made the universe with life in mind, physical life. Now I'm going to be discussing the moral argument for the existence of God, and for the longest time, this was one of my least favorite arguments for the existence of God. Not because it's a bad argument or anything like that. It's mostly because as I presented this argument in the past, I've often poorly explained the argument. I failed to do it justice. And so therefore, as I presented this argument, it wasn't as good as it ought to have been. However, I thought about this argument for some time, and I realized, frankly, the teleological argument is a lot more difficult to understand. So if you guys got through the last presentation just fine, this is basically going to be a cakewalk. So let's see if I can actually present this argument as I ought to. Actually, speaking of ought, that's a good place to start. I think as a baseline, we can all agree that there are certain things we ought to do and certain things we ought not to do. I think we
So this is already going to be an issue because it's ambiguous what that means. So we can all agree that there's things that we ought to do and things that we ought not to do. What do you mean by that? So that is consistent with both realist and anti-realist positions. So even if I agree with that, it's one of these claims that philosophers do this a lot, where they will give you a sentence that is supposed to be reflective of ordinary language, like stealing from people for personal gain is morally wrong. That's supposed to be a statement in ordinary language. Now, in many cases, the statements are a little contrived. That's not the sort of thing people would typically say quite that precisely, but it's a close enough analog that we could give philosophers a pass on that and say, okay, that's kind of like the sorts of things people say in ordinary language. And then we're supposed to assign or have a judgment about whether the statement in question is true or false before we have some specific conception of its meaning. Um, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I don't know why philosophers are inclined to do this. I guess you could have an analog to where if I were to give you a sentence in English, I could ask you, is the sentence grammatical or not? And you could judge whether the sentence is grammatical or not prior to even having any clear sense of what specific grammatical issue it may or may not have. So if you judge it's not grammatical, you might not even be aware of what about it isn't grammatical. Like, is there some, whatever the issue would be, you may not know exactly what it is, but people may be pretty good at judging the grammaticality of sentences, even if they don't have a good formal sense of the rules of English grammar. So you could have an analog and say, okay, well, we have an implicit sense of moral principles or philosophical views that drives our judgments about what's true or false in the relevant philosophical context. And so when we encounter some ordinary language sentence like stealing for personal gain is morally wrong, something like that, and we judge, yeah, that's true, we can then go, okay, so it's fine to judge that that's true. And now we could go about reverse engineering what implicit commitments we have, philosophically speaking, that undergird or explain why we would judge that to be true. And then it could be that what it means is an expression of our subjective moral standards, or what it is an attempt to refer to stance-independent moral facts. And so we know it's true. Now just the question is, well, what is it that makes it true? Why is it true? I have a big problem with this approach because it's not clear to me in the case of moral claims that there is any particular meta-ethical analysis that is implicit as some sort of shared commitment in ordinary discourse, such that we can just judge it to be true and then reverse engineer what like the correct interpretation of the sentence is. That kind of approach already takes on a contentious set of presuppositions about how language and meaning work and how human psychology works and how we should go about doing philosophy. Now, some philosophers might insist that they're not making empirical claims when they do this sort of thing. Okay, then so here's the issue. You could call it a kind of empiricist's dilemma. If they're not making empirical claims, then they're helping themselves to a methodological approach that I, on philosophical grounds, already reject. If they are making empirical claims, now I'm going to want to see the empirical data that supports the claims in question. Even if, for instance, contemporary English speakers that we happen to be familiar with speak in a particular way and have a shared moral semantics, it doesn't follow that the speakers of the other 7,000 plus languages in the world speak the same way, or that people outside the cultural communities that we're familiar with that are English speakers speak the same way, nor does it entail that people historically spoke the same way. And so philosophers, if they aren't making empirical claims, I'm off the boat, I have problems. If they are making empirical claims, they're doing a very bad job of it. Call that the empiricist dilemma. And I think this is a very serious problem for the armchair and a prioristic approaches that philosophers take to these sorts of questions. Okay, let's keep going with this. I know I'm 1 minute in and I already have an issue.
We can all agree some things are good and other things are eat, steal, and murder people, and it's good to be loving and compassionate towards others, and generous, for example. And even if someone disagreed with that assessment, it would still be wrong.
Right. So here is where I definitely do not agree. There seems to be an implication here. Remember what he said. Let's take it back.
Through the last presentation just fine. This is basically going to be a cakewalk. So let's see if I can actually present this argument as I ought to. Actually, speaking of ought, that's a good place to start. I think as a baseline, we can all agree that there are certain things we ought to do and certain
He says, I think as a baseline, we can all agree. So there seems to be a presumption here that a starting point for this discussion is that we agree on certain sorts of things. And then first, we begin with us agreeing to judge certain first order or normative moral claims to be true. Not just that we judge certain claims to be morally, like certain moral claims to be true and certain moral claims to be false. He goes on to suggest that we even agree on some of the specific content of those normative moral claims. All else being equal, I agree with that. Like I share certain normative standards with most other people, but look what he does after that.
things we ought not to do. I think we can all agree some things are good and other things are bad.
I agree with that.
It's bad to lie, cheat, steal, and murder people, and it's good to be loving and compassionate towards others
And I agree with that.
and generous, for example. And even if someone disagreed with that assessment, it would still be wrong.
Okay, so this is going to be a problem. Even if someone disagreed with that assessment of the nature of morality, it would still be true. Okay, depends who someone is, because if it's me disagreeing, then no, I don't think it would still be true. So when I make moral claims, I'm talking about my own moral standards. If I disagreed about the moral issues that he just described, I would not agree with him. You know, for instance, if for whatever reason I thought generosity were morally bad, I would not agree that it's true that generosity is morally good, even though I think that it's morally bad. As for other people, if by someone he's referring to people other than me, I don't care what other people think. My moral standards express my values, not other people's values. And so I think we're already having a problem here. I mean, a couple problems. One is he's starting from the outset by saying this there's something we can all agree to. First, he says, you know, that normative moral claims, like we'll treat some of them as true and false. We'll judge some to be true and false. Then he makes specific normative moral claims. We allegedly agree on those. When he gets to this point, is this part of what we're all supposed to agree to? Because I don't agree to this part. One, I think it's ambiguous. And two, it sounds like it's implying something like a rejection of stance dependent views and is implying, I don't know how directly or indirectly, some type of realist view. And I don't think that we all agree to that. I mean, one, a substantial proportion of philosophers don't agree with this. So you get 26.1% of philosophers in the 2020 Phil Paper survey report being anti-realist, at least those that were responding to the Phil Paper survey. You get another, what is it, 14 or 15% that choose other. They don't unambiguously endorse some type of moral realism. You have constructivists that may or may not agree with this. So that's going to be a problem. And that's just looking at the analytic philosophical tradition. Well, the survey has continental philosophers, but it's a predominantly analytic tradition. What would happen if you presented these sorts of questions to continental philosophers or people outside the Western philosophical traditions? I don't know. I don't know what they would say. So we're not in a position to make judgments about that unless we gather data on that. And then as far as how people without philosophical training would respond to this sort of question, it's again an open question what they think, if anything, in particular about these sorts of questions. So here we have someone saying something like we can all agree, or we do all agree to this. That's an empirical claim about human moral psychology. It's an underspecified claim, and it's unclear if it's true. To the extent that this is supposed to be part of that, I would say that I either have no way of judging whether I would agree with this or not until the ambiguities are resolved. But to the extent that I can make sense of it, I disagree with this. I wouldn't agree to this. So, and I don't think that most people are implicitly or explicitly inclined to endorse or agree with this view. I don't think most people are moral realists or that they speak or think or act like moral realists. So this is already a problem.
Now, I don't think that's really a controversial claim by any means, but the thing is, that implies
See,
something
he says
very-
he doesn't think that's a controversial claim. It depends what you mean by controversial. I would take it to be quite controversial. I mean, at least I'm disagreeing with the idea. Is that enough to make it controversial? Probably not. But it's not like anti-realism is a completely fringe view, and it sounds like it at least sounds like he's saying people are realists and that's not controversial. If he's not saying that, then this wasn't super clear, or at least that people are not relativists and that's not controversial. Again, though, I wouldn't agree with that. I don't know that it's clear that people aren't relativists or not. I mean, I don't think they are, but I don't think that I don't think that people are moral relativists, but I don't take that to mean that therefore they're moral realists. So I don't think people have a determinate view about this at all. So Cody just sent me a sticker. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. All right, let's keep going with the video, and then I'll have a look at the comments when we get through more than 1 minute of this.
Very interesting. If we actually ought to do certain things and avoid other things, this seems to imply there is an objective standard for morality. So what is
Look at that. All kinds of concerns here.
But the thing is, that implies something very interesting. If we actually ought to do certain
Note the misleading modifier, if we actually ought to do things. Well, I'm an anti-realist. I think I actually ought to do things. I think other people actually ought to do things. Depends what you mean by actually. If by actually you mean stance independently, then I don't think that. I don't think people actually should or shouldn't do anything, or that anything is actually good or bad. But that's not a very illuminating way of saying that things are good or bad, right or wrong in the relevant sense, because it's helping itself to the presumption that only the realist view offers an actual account of goodness or badness. I use this comparison a lot. People that are already familiar with this channel already know what I'm going to say. I'm going to make a gastronomic analogy. I am not a realist about whether food is objectively or stands independently good or bad, independent of how it tastes to me or to anybody else. I'm a gastronomic anti-realist. I suspect many people on reflection would endorse gastronomic anti-realism as well. They would not think that whether food is good or bad or what you should or shouldn't eat for purely gastronomic purposes. I don't mean for practical, like you should buy this over that because it's cheaper or healthier or more ethical, something like that. Not talking about that. I'm talking about purely its gastronomic qualities. I'm not a realist about that. I suspect most of my audience isn't a realist about that. Many of you are probably anti-realists about that. Now, does that mean that none of us think that food is actually good or bad? What would that mean? Like if I was like, yeah, no food is actually good or bad. So is that supposed to have practical implications? If I go to a restaurant, am I indifferent to what food I eat? And you could generalize this to aesthetic or taste judgments more generally. I don't think there's objective or stance independent normative facts about what music is good or bad or what movies are good or bad. Does that mean that no movies are actually good and no music is actually good? Like if that's supposed to have some sort of practical implication, it would imply that I should be indifferent to movies, I should be indifferent to music, I should be indifferent to what I eat. I'm not indifferent. And I don't think that that's a reasonable way to use the term actually. I think food actually is good or bad. And that what it is for food to actually be good or to actually be bad is for it to be good according to my preferences or bad according to my preferences and so on for my other taste preferences. So this use of actually is tendentious, and I really wish realists would stop using it.
things and avoid other things, this seems to imply there is an objective standard for morality.
So you could just say the way that people speak, or it's uncontroversial that people tend to think in ways that presuppose realism. You could make that claim. Sounds like an empirical claim to me. There's not good empirical evidence for this. I've talked about this at length on my channel and on my blog. You can go check out my blog if you haven't seen it before. So I have a background in both philosophy and psychology. I did my primary research on the empirical question of whether or not non-philosophers are moral realists. And I canvassed all the academic research on this, the research that attempts to explicitly address the question of whether people, non-philosophers, people without significant formal training in philosophy, endorse moral realism or not. And my takeaway from that literature is that we don't have valid measures for determining whether people are moral realists or not, and that the best explanation available to us currently is that people probably don't have views about this one way or another. And I make a comparison to quantum mechanics. People don't typically, like if I just went out and canvassed people on the street, they don't typically have a way of a position on how to interpret quantum mechanics. So they're not going to be Copenhagians or hidden variable proponents or many worlds proponents of quantum mechanics. They don't have views on this because it's not something that they've thought about, and it's not something that animates or is relevant to everyday causal claims. Michael Gill, in his paper Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics, someone whose work was a big inspiration for my own research, makes a similar point about mathematical Platonism, that when people go around adding up numbers, if you're paying a bill at a restaurant or something like that, you don't have to take a stance on mathematical Platonism. You don't have to be a nominalist or something like that, because those sorts of disputes just aren't relevant to everyday mathematical discourse. So I think the same is true of metaethics, that whether you're a realist or an anti-realist just wouldn't matter for everyday moral discourse and everyday moral interactions. And I think that as a result, that the metaethical positions that philosophers take are largely practically superfluous and are not reflected in implicit commitments in the way that people speak or think or do things, morally speaking, generally. So thought, speech, behavior, that sort of thing. Uh, it goes beyond that though, because it's not just that I don't think that this is like an implicit commitment. I don't think people hold views about these things, and I think that the only way that a person would come to adopt one of these views is either through some direct or indirect engagement with philosophy. I think these are positions more or less that philosophers make up, and that are almost entirely superfluous, practically irrelevant, and have very little to do with everyday thought and discourse. Okay, let's have a look at the chats. Let's see. Let's see. All right. Yeah, Sully says, but ordinary people meaningfully communicate using these terms without having a meta-ethical analysis. Yeah, well, you don't have to have a meta-ethical analysis like explicitly for there to be one implicit in the way that you speak, I suppose. I just don't see any good reason to think that there is one that's implicit in the way that people speak, or at least that one or another of competing analyses of ordinary language are definitively superior to the other. If relativism and realism, like some non-relativist realist account and some stance-dependent, anti-realist relativist account, do an equally good job of accounting for what people are doing, it's not that I'm like, okay, well, it's one or the other, but we just aren't in a position to know. I just don't see any particular reason to attribute either of these to people. Oh, right. So Jeremy says it wouldn't even be a disagreement with respect to a single proposition because it would be different propositions, different indices on a template. Our new review, as I understand it. So I have a blog post where I address this as well. I should go write an article on this. I think that philosophers have an unnecessarily narrow conception of disagreement, where they construe disagreement to just be disputes about the truth of propositional claims, and that's one construal of disagreement. But I also think that a an equally, if not much more, I actually think it's more important. A more important disagreement are what you could call disagreements not about what's true, but disagreements about what to do, and these are more like coordinating disagreements. So take an instance of which you and a friend or a spouse or whatever significant other are trying to make a decision about where to go for dinner. You may disagree about where to go to dinner. Does that require you to think that there's a stance independent normative fact about where you ought to go to dinner? It's a very weird position to take. And yet you could still disagree on where you should go for dinner. And so in those sorts of cases, the disagreement perfectly makes sense. And people will argue with one another and they'll raise points. They'll try to convince one another, oh, we should go, hey, let's go get pizza. No, we had pizza last week. Okay, then let's go to the sushi place. No, I'm not up for sushi. Uh, and that place is too expensive anyway. Or okay, so let's go to the pasta place. Nah, it's too far away. So you raise points and considerations with one another, you argue with one another, even though there's no presumption that there's a stance independent normative fact. And then, consider disputes between countries or individuals that are negotiating. Two people in the battlefield. Let's make a truce. Oh, I want this. Okay, you make this concession. I'll make that concession. You don't have to think that there is an objective or a stance independent fact of the matter about what the contents of the treaty should consist in. There is simply whatever the two of you would intersubjectively agree to. It's the same thing with just haggling in the price of something. Let's say someone wants to sell something to you for $20 and you go, I'll give you 10. And they're like 15 and you go 12 and they go sold. Okay. Is there price realism? Is there a stance independent fact about the true price? No, there's just whatever price you'll agree to. That's the price. And you could still argue. So if they say 20, you could say that's way too much. I could go down the street and get it, for no more than $15. And they could say, yeah, but my product is a higher quality and it's more effort for you to go down the street. They could raise points in favor of their view. They could say, have a look at mine. You could examine it. They don't even let you touch theirs. It's behind the counter. Maybe it's not as good. You can raise points for and against the price that you're suggesting to the other person, and it may or may not land with that other person. And they're the sort of arbiter of whether that point is relevant to their appraisal or reappraisal of the price of the product. But this is a fully intersubjective dispute that you're having. Disagreements do not require people to think that there are conflicting propositions. This is ridiculous. I don't know where philosophers got this idea. This is an overly formalistic and honestly kind of goofy way to think about disagreement. The disagreements have to concern disputes about the truth of propositions. Okay, so call those truth disagreements. Fine. So for relativists, there's no truth disagreements. Fine, we have coordinative disagreements. So we have another type of disagreement. And it'd be really weird to not call those disagreements. So two people are arguing about where to go get dinner. Are philosophers going to tell me that it's not a part of ordinary language to call those disagreements? I mean, they could try to stipulate their disagreements. They could just insist, no, by definition, those aren't agreements. Okay, so we don't have disagreements. Then we have conflicts. Like they're not going to win by stipulating their way to a victory. You could still have a conflict. Then people have conflicts, even if they don't have disagreements. Big whoop. It doesn't change anything about the nature of what's going on in those sorts of cases. So, yeah, I do think that there are disagreements if you're a relativist. And also do keep in mind, if you're a culture relativist and it's two people that are members of the same culture and they disagree, one of them is going to be wrong relative to that culture, or at least one of them. And so disagreement is certainly consistent with cultural relativism. It's often consistent. It can be consistent with various types of constructivism. If you're an ideal observer theorist and someone else is too, you could disagree about what the ideal observer would favor. Not a problem. If you're some sort of anti-realist that believes moral facts are facts about God's commands, you could disagree about what God's commands are. If you're a Humean constructivist, someone could point out to you that your own, downstream moral standards, like let's say you're in favor of the death penalty or something, but you also are utilitarian. If they point out to you, or they argue, or they convince you that the death penalty doesn't maximize utility, you could go, oh, okay, so it turns out I was incorrect about the moral permissibility of the death penalty. I should be against the death penalty. So it's possible to be incorrect as an anti-realist and for someone else to correct you and to argue by appealing to non-moral considerations. So there are all sorts of ways that anti-realists can argue with one another. There are ways in which they could be wrong about facts that are relevant to their normative moral standards. There are ways in which they could come into conflict with one another. This idea that anti-realists or relativists can't argue or disagree with one another is ridiculous. And it rests on an arbitrarily rigid conception of what a disagreement is, and a very crude and limited form of relativism that I've never heard of any anti-realist endorsing. I mean, that's not to say some don't, but critics of anti-realism often seem to present criticisms of the most flat-footed and awkward types of anti-realism you could possibly imagine. All right. So Nitty says, wait, most people don't act as realists in what sense? Maybe people act like anti-realists, and then when they sit through apologetics, they equivocate norms with realism. Well, what would it mean to act like a realist? What specifically would you do? I mean, here's the thing you might do if you act like a realist. You might go, I think that there are stance-independent moral facts. You might go, I'm a moral realist. Those are things that a moral realist would do that an anti-realist probably wouldn't, unless the anti-realist is lying. Someone that's a realist might deliberate about what stands independently true. So there might be certain sorts of cognitive events that occur that are not publicly available. It's not just speech acts. So they might reason in certain ways. They might speak in certain ways, but I don't know what substantive practically relevant actions would be indicative of or only explained by describing the person as a realist. So I just don't think that there's much that people do that would indicate that they're acting like a realist. Like, let's say you were observing a person go about their daily business. What would they say or do that would demonstrate unequivocally that they're a moral realist? What would they say or do? I think there's not much other than things like if the person were to like fill out a survey and bubble in, I'm a realist on it, whereas, let's say I said somebody's a theist. Well, if I see them praying or I see them, engaged in worship, or we have some access to their thought processes and they're thinking about God or something like that, there would be some outward behavioral indicators. There would be some cognitive indicators. If you're a realist, what are the indicators other than you think things like I'm a realist, or you say things like I'm a realist? There's not much else. There might be a few things, but I question how much practical significance they have for everyday actions. Yeah, Digital Gnosis said, I feel like I'm going to get mad hearing the actually argument a million times. Yeah, it's over and over and over and over. This actually. Only realists think things are actually good or bad, actually really good or bad, genuinely good or bad, truly good or bad. It's very, very annoying. It's very sloppy, that kind of language, and they should stop doing it. Nathan says, someone should make a compilation of how many times Lance has responded to this. If you want to make compilations, I'm happy to host them on my channel. You feel free to do it, but post them on your own channels. I don't care. All right. Vex said, I only just got the pun in your channel name and it's brilliant. Well, I didn't come up with it, so don't give me the credit. What about imposing universal morals on others? I see that happen all the time. I impose my standards on others, or would if I had the power to do so. There's no inconsistency between that and being a relativist or an anti-realist. All right. Jeremy Gort says that there's something external world realists would be expected to do differently from idealists. Sorry, I think it froze up there. Is there something that external world realists would be expected to do differently from idealists? Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, I don't think there is anything. Yeah, what would they do differently other than say things like, I believe in external world realism? All right. Right. I think that's it for the comments. Let's keep going.
So what does that mean? Well, it means that there is an objective standard of what behaviors are right and wrong. If you were taking a math test, for example, the person who is grading your test will use an objective standard to see if you're correct or not. They're going to look for whether or not you used the right methods and equations to answer the question, and whether your answer actually lines up with the correct answer you should have got had you used the proper methods to answer that question. And so this grader is using an objective standard in order to grade your test. And similarly with our behavior.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that that's the best comparison. So there's some ambiguity about the term objective. Objective, in the sense relevant to moral realism, is the view that the facts are not made true by our stances or the perspective of some culture or something like that. Like they're not made true relative to some stance. So that's what realism is all about. But what he's describing here, he might have that in mind by like mathematical objectivity. But it's also possible to use a socially constructed measurement standard that we intersubjectively agree to employ. That standard can then map onto or correspond. Arguably, I don't mean that in the full-throated sense of a correspondence theorist about truth. But let's say you use like inches or centimeters or something like that. That maps onto the world, so to speak. And so if we all agree to use the metric system, then we agree that we have an objective standard. And in that sense, what makes the standard objective is that there's this publicly agreed upon criteria by which we would resolve a particular question, like how tall is this tree, something like that. So it's the provisioning of a shared standard by which to make an evaluation that is systematic and similar across different evaluators. So that is a different type or different sense of objectivity than the sense of it being stance independent. I'm not sure which sense he has in mind, so I don't think that the particular description he's given here is the best example. I wouldn't give an example that's ambiguous between the correct reading and what I just described here, which would be an incorrect reading, because that's a different sense of objectivity.
There seems to be an objective standard being used when we judge people for doing what's wrong or
it seems. So note the language of this passive language.
This grader is using an objective standard in order to grade your test. And similarly with our behavior, there seems to be an objective standard being used when
There seems to be an objective standard being used. There seems to be. This is like saying there seems to be a tree over there, or it seems that this cup over here is red. Well, when you say it seems to be or there seems to be, seemings don't just exist in a void. Things don't just seem to be the case. Something can't just seem. Things have to seem to. They could seem that a certain way to you or to me or to everyone. Nothing just seems. That's like saying this object is seen, or this object is making a sound in the sense of some sort of auditory perception, is being heard. Okay, it's being heard. Imagine I said, I dropped an object and I said, this object is being heard. Nothing is just heard. Something can only be heard by you or by me or by people. So it seems that morality is being treated this way. It doesn't seem that way to me. I just surveyed my own students, and I do this every time I teach classes where meta-ethics comes up. I almost always get virtual unanimity of students endorsing relativism, sometimes literal unanimity. This is a common experience that instructors have. So most of the people I interact with are moral anti-realists, and they don't appear to me to be speaking like realists. Does that mean that most people are anti-realists? No, but I don't have this experience of running into people and having the sense that they speak like realism is true, or that they think that there are objective truths and falsehoods to our moral claims. That's not my experience. Who is experiencing people this way? Why is it only, well, maybe a lot of anti realists would agree. Realists will make claims like this, but these are empirical claims and they're very underspecified claims. Like when you say it seems this way, it seems to you, to people in general. What exactly is the claim? And why are philosophers just never specific about this sort of thing? It's very strange. Why not say it seems to me, or it seems to most professionals, or it seems to most experts, or it seems to most people, or it seems to most English speakers, or it seems to most people with significant training in philosophy? There's no good reason not to take the few seconds it takes to specify who the seemings refer to.
Judge people for doing what's wrong or commend them for doing what's right. But if morality is objective, then what is the foundation for morality? Basically, why is there an objective standard for morality? Well, what Christians and other theists will say is this: if morality is objective, then it must be grounded in some sort of necessary and transcendent source, and that source would be God.
Now, it's a nice claim. Is there a good argument for the claim? Are there good reasons to believe that this is true? So let's say that we're moral realists. So for whatever reason, allegedly, moral realism requires some sort of transcendent being. Why?
To simplify, if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. But because objective moral values and duties exist, God exists. Another way.
So that's a summary or a way of articulating William Lane Craig's moral argument.
Some people have put it as this: if there's an actual objective moral law that we ought to follow, a law that dictates that some things are good and other things are bad, that moral law must have a moral law giver.
Yeah, so people make this claim, and again, what is the argument for this claim? Maybe he hopefully he'll go on and tell us more about like why, if there's a moral law, there has to be a lawgiver. Why? I'm not one to defend secular moral realism. I probably make more videos critiquing secular moral realism than anyone. Is there some channel where people do more videos critiquing secular moral realism? Like I do this a couple times a week. So I'm not going to be someone to defend secular moral realism, but I don't see any particular reason to think you have to have theism to have any particular type of moral realism, other than one that trivially is like moral facts are stance independent facts that are grounded in God or something like that. There'd be some way of specifying that the facts in question require God, but okay, why think that for there to be stance independent moral facts that there would have to be a God? Let's see.
And that lawgiver would be God. Now, some people might obviously push back on this. They might ask a pretty reasonable question. Isn't it people and societies that ultimately determine what's right and wrong? Isn't it society that determines morality? So society is the source of morality. Well, if that is what someone claims, then all I have to say is, I really hope they're wrong. And why do I say?
Okay, give me one moment.
Say that? Well,
Right.
wrong. Isn't it society that determines morality? So society is the source of morality. Well, if that is what someone claims, then all I have to say is, I really hope they're wrong. And why do I say that? Well, it's because.
One moment. I got a barky dog. Give me a second. Oof, sorry about that. I'm going to replay that for a third time. I'm so sorry. Got dogs. Sometimes they bark at stuff.
Because difference, isn't it society that determines
Okay, so here's one sort of response to the idea that we've got to go with moral realism and it requires a God. Hey, isn't there an alternative here, which is that society determines what's morally right or wrong?
morality? So society is the source of morality. Well, if that is what someone claims, then all I have to say is, I really hope they're wrong. And
so, note here, I really hope they're wrong. And then he's going to go on to talk about how this has bad implications. That in and of itself is not a good reason to think that the position is wrong. So the typical sort of anti-realist views that are out there in the literature, like sort of traditional anti-realism, begins with a kind of semantic thesis, a thesis about what people mean when they make moral claims. Now, what if what people mean just is a report about what's right or wrong relative to their culture? And so the typical meaning of a moral claim, like an ordinary discourse, just was something like my culture approves of this, my culture approves of that. Okay, then if we're going with a sort of standard analytic philosophical approach, the way that ordinary people use these terms fixes the meaning of those terms. And so the correct analysis of the meaning of ordinary moral language would be some type of cultural relativism. And if you don't like the consequences of that, tough shit. Like that's just what people mean when they use moral language. Now, you can be against that, and you could say, okay, well, I don't care if that's what people mean. I'm going to go ahead and act, on my values or act in a way that's inconsistent with the moral facts. Yeah, I would encourage that. So if some culture decides that genocide is great, I'm not going to go, well, the meaning of the sentence genocide is great uh, means our culture approves of genocide. And so because moral facts just are facts about what cultures agree to, I've got to be okay with genocide. That's ridiculous. Why would I think that? Why would I be somehow obliged to act in accord with like a particular type of semantic interpretation or analysis of a particular type of discourse in a particular language? Why would I care? Why would you care? So people, English speakers, happen to use words a certain way. Therefore, I'm somehow bound to comply with this. Why? Who cares? It's the same thing. This isn't just an issue. If you take the sort of analysis of knowledge as a normative concept, what if it turns out that the way that ordinary speakers use the term knowledge is kind of stupid? Like it's not a very useful way. Like what the criteria they use for determining what we know and what we don't know is not very useful. Okay, why would I go around complying my judgments about what I quote unquote know or don't know on the basis of ordinary discourse? Why would I do that? Well, because that's the correct account of knowledge. Well, then I guess I don't care about knowledge. I care about, schmowledge or something else like that. But, I wouldn't take that view because I don't think that my use of terminology is somehow beholden to ordinary usage. I'm happy to abandon the way ordinary people happen to speak or think and say, no, I'm going to use these terms the way I want to refer to what I want to, and to speak, think, and act how I want to in ways that I think are most profitable and useful and conducive to my goals and ends. I don't think that we need to take our philosophical positions to be somehow weirdly beholden to the ordinary language in the first place. But many analytic philosophers do think this. And if they think this, and if it turns out that ordinary language just is, relativistic, it's cultural relativism as the correct analysis on ordinary moral discourse, too bad. Like, then that's what people mean. And if you don't like the consequences of that, that doesn't make the position false. So this idea that like, I sure hope it's not true, that's a bit odd. But also, this isn't the only option available to anti-realists in the first place. I think he's going to go on to imply that, hey, here's an alternative to moral realism, some specific type of agent relativism, and that would be bad. We should reject that. Okay, well, I would agree with that, but I don't think that therefore moral realism. So you have to be careful about that because that wouldn't be a genuine dichotomy. I don't endorse moral realism or agent relativism. Okay, let's keep going.
And why do I say that? Well, it's because different societies had different, often incompatible moral ideas. For example, and I apologize for bringing up a very heavy topic here, but I think we can all agree that infanticide and rape are wrong. I think we would look at someone very strangely if they disagreed with that. The problem is, when you look at ancient Rome, they didn't actually hold to that same standard. In ancient Rome, if you were the man of the household, that gave you the right to do whatever you wanted with whoever you wanted in your household. Additionally, doing things like raping a slave, prostitute, prisoner of war, or even someone who wasn't a Roman citizen weren't generally considered immoral actions in the Roman Empire. Similarly, with infanticide, if a mother didn't want to raise her baby, it was often quite common for her to simply leave the baby outside to die of exposure because, well, she didn't want it. And so what we often take for granted as common sense universal morals were anything but universal. And what this means is that society cannot be the foundation for morality, because otherwise,
Well, hold up.
infanticide and rape would therefore be morally permissible in some societies, just not in others. Another issue with the idea that society
Okay, hold on. I got barky dog issue. All right. She's real worked up about something. I don't know what it is.
Society tried to die of exposure because, well, she didn't want it. And so what we often take for granted as common sense universal morals were anything but universal. And what this means is that society cannot be the foundation for morality, because otherwise infanticide and rape would therefore be morally permissible in some societies, just not in others.
Yeah, so it sounds like he's describing some type of agent cultural relativism, and I would reject it. But I wouldn't reject it because I think that it stands independently wrong. I would reject it because the values he describes are inconsistent with my values. So it's not difficult for an anti-realist to reject this sort of view. And so this, so far it's like, okay, well, hey, what about agent culture relativism? Yep, let's reject that. Okay, that doesn't leave us in a particularly good position to say, therefore, moral realism. That just means we should reject a particularly repugnant type of anti-realism. Big deal.
Another issue with the idea that society creates morality is that moral progress would be impossible if that was actually true. Think of it this way. If societies are what create morality, then whatever the majority thinks is moral, because after all, societies are just basically collections of individuals, so it's effectively majority rule. And if that's the case, this would lead us to some pretty absurd conclusions, such as the idea that chattel slavery, eugenics, and genocide were of course morally fine, because societies accepted them at different times in their past. These things only became bad when we changed our mind about them. In the same way that, fashion trends kind of come and go, so too would moral trends come and go. Perhaps 100 years ago, or not 100, like 200 to 300 years ago, slavery was okay. Now it's not in vogue. Who knows? It might be in vogue again sometime later. Who's to say? And so therefore, moral progress wouldn't be possible if societies are what determine morality, because after all.
Okay, so I've talked about this in a million other videos. We'll talk about it again here. We have to draw a distinction when it comes to relativism between agent relativism and appraiser relativism. Agent relativism is the view that individuals or cultures fix or determine what's morally right or wrong for themselves. So if a person thinks it's okay for them to torture babies, it is in fact morally okay for them to torture babies. And if you're a cultural agent relativist, then if there's a culture that engages in, for instance, ritual human sacrifice, then it's morally good for that culture to engage in ritual human sacrifice. And to the extent that they do so, because that culture fixes what's morally good for that culture to do, you would be obliged to judge what they're doing is morally good. So, one moment, dog barky again. Jeez, it's really distracting. Maybe all of you can handle a dog barking in the background a little bit, but I find it just intensely distracting. So I think someone's doing housework. I'm really sorry about that. That's what happens when you live stream. Stuff like that happens. But she just keeps barking. There's nothing going on. There's no like threats or anything. But she's barky, so that's just how that goes. Often at night, it's a little darker. She can't see as many squirrels outside, and she's a little less prone to bark when I'm doing this in the middle of the day. All right, let's keep going. I'll roll it back. Oh, that's frustrating. Let me roll it back.
It was okay.
Okay, so right, I was talking about the distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. Okay, so agent relativism is the view that whether an action is right or wrong is judged relative to the standards of the agent performing that action or the culture of the agent performing that action. And so if there's a person on agent individual relativism that thinks it's okay to torture people, it's good for them to torture people. And if you're an agent relativist and they said, hey, I'm okay with torturing people, you would be obliged to think it's okay for them to torture people. And then the same thing would apply at the cultural level. If you're an agent culture relativist, then you would think something like if some culture engages in ritual human sacrifice, it's morally good for members of that culture to engage in ritual human sacrifice. And this is the kind of, society's determined morality view that he's describing here. This isn't your only option. As a relativist, you could also be an appraiser relativist. An appraiser relativist judges whether an action is right or wrong relative to the standards of their culture or their personal moral values. And so appraiser relativism holds that actions are judged as right or wrong relative to the standards of whoever's evaluating the action in question or the culture of the agent evaluating the action, which is typically going to be you. And so if you're an appraiser relativist and you or your culture is anti-human sacrifice or anti-baby torture, then when you say baby torture is wrong, you mean something like, I disapprove of baby torture, or my culture is against baby torture. And that view of appraiser relativism does not oblige you to think that if some culture practices eugenics or practices slavery or practices genocide, that it's morally good for them to do so. You would say, nope, it's morally bad for them to do so. So, this is a very common thing for people to do when arguing for moral realism, is to set up as its opposition agent relativism in particular, which has these really goofy and weird implications, and then say, look how stupid this view is. Yeah, it's stupid. So what? It's one of the least plausible anti-realist views out there. Big deal. Okay. So far, what we're getting is a critique of agent relativism. I just agree with his critique. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with his critiques here. I agree. Yeah, the kind of view he's describing strikes me as repugnant and horrific, and I disagree with it. I disagree with it for different reasons. I don't disagree with it because I think it fails to recognize that there are stance independent moral facts. I find it personally repugnant, and it would require me to consider as good things I don't consider good, and I wouldn't consider good. So I would reject the view too for different reasons. Okay. We have someone new here and they asked a question about this. All right, let's have a look. Oh, there were more comments since then. Let's find it. Let's find it. Jeremy says, let's make sure to point out that our world doesn't even have a quantity ordinary language. It has many different natural languages and some artificial ones. Yeah, I mean, that is a good point to make. There's no such thing as ordinary language. There's a bunch of different languages, and what's ordinary in one language may or may not be ordinary in another language. Often there's this assumption that philosophers make, which is that people in different languages are more or less just speaking the same way by different means, and I don't agree. Koopa says, I'm new to this meta-ethics and philosophy thing. Which moral anti-realist views are not agent relativist? So there's a bunch of them. Pretty much every form of non-cognitivism or expressivism, quasi-realism, constructivism, ideal observer theory, some type of anti-realist account that hinges the moral facts on God's commands or something like that. I'm not saying divine command theory has to be anti-realist. A lot of divine command theorists are going to have a realist version of divine command theory. My view, anti-realist quietism, various types of relativism that are not agent relativism. So appraiser relativism would be the main one. I guess you could have some hybrid account. So like David Wong's account, which has both relativist and non-relativist components. So you have a whole bunch of options for not being an agent relativist. So it's really weird to set up realism versus agent relativism. It's not a genuine dichotomy. He didn't explicitly say that it is. He's just presenting one possible counter argument to realism, and it's not a good one. And so it's good to talk about why that's wrong. But I hope that's not going to be leveraged to say this is wrong, therefore realism. And I'm not saying he did do that or will do that, but I just really hope not. Yakasha says, to steal me on the side a little bit, I will say that it can feel like having a moral preference that aligns with others can make you feel connected to them and part of a larger whole society. I agree with that. That's consistent with anti-realism. Beck says, isn't he just arguing in facts at this point because he just showed societies do establish what they believe is moral? Well, societies establish what they believe is moral. That doesn't mean that they establish what is moral. There's an important distinction to have there. So no, he's not making a mistake there. Looking through the comments. Hey, J-Mike, I haven't seen you. We were supposed to talk like a year ago at this point? What is up with that? All right, let's keep going with the video.
Now it's not in vogue. Who knows? It might be in vogue again sometime later. Who's to say? And so therefore, moral progress wouldn't be possible if societies are what determine morality. Because after all, there would be no greater standard outside of your society to actually gauge what is moral if society.
Yeah, so this objection that you can't have moral progress, yeah, okay, so we could just grant for the sake of argument that you can't have moral progress as an agent relativist, whatever. You could totally have progress as an appraiser relativist. And this idea, a lot of times critics of anti-realist views will say you can't have progress without realism, which is, note what he says here.
Therefore, moral progress wouldn't be possible if societies are what determine morality. Because after all, there would be no greater standard outside of your society to actually gauge what is moral.
Because there would be no greater standard outside of your society to gauge what is moral. Now, I am not an agent relativist, but I don't think there is any, external standard independent of my standards or cultural standards or individual standards to gauge whether progress has occurred or not. You don't need that at all. So think about if you set an exercise goal for yourself, I'm going to run a 10K or whatever. Can you make progress towards that goal? You sure can. You can make progress in video games. You can make progress on personal hobbies. You can make progress on your artwork. You could think that you're making progress towards getting better and better at art, and you can make progress towards, achieving art that you find increasingly more beautiful. That doesn't require you to be an aesthetic realist. This doesn't require us to be exercise realists and to think that there are stance-independent facts. There's some external fact of the matter about what exercises you should or shouldn't be engaged in. People make progress towards personal hobbies, goals, and things that are entirely a matter of personal evaluation all the time. The idea that you can't make progress without an external standard, why would I buy that? I find that to be completely ridiculous. I think that the only way to make progress is relative to standards. So not only do I not think it makes any sense to talk about, not only do I deny that you could only make progress in some non-relative way, I think you, in fact, can only do the opposite. You can only make progress relative to some goal or standard. And the idea of there being some non-relative standard strikes me as borderline meaningless. Like, it doesn't have to depend on a stance, but whatever. And so you could have a non-relative single stance. You could say, okay, well, we're going to fix the meaning of certain sorts of terms to refer to this particular standard. Nothing is being indexed according to different standards. And so there's a single standard, kind of like ideal observer theory. And then you can make progress relative to that, but it wouldn't really be relativism because nothing is really being indexed according to two or more different standards. Okay. So there, you could have a kind of stance independent progress. You could have that maybe conceptually. Maybe I'm okay with that. But even if you could, that's okay. You could still have progress relative to, relative standards, to stance dependent standards as well. There's no conceptual issue there, at least for me. And I haven't seen anyone raise a good objection to the idea that you could make progress. I'll just simplify this. I think it's completely obvious that you can make progress with respect to completely self-determined or subjective standards. You can set some standard like I want to make art that's more beautiful, or I want to cook food that people find more enjoyable. Those goals do not require there to be any objective or stance independent standard about what art is beautiful or what food is tasty that's true independent of people's evaluations. And yet you can make progress. Have you ever thought anybody's made progress at being a better dancer or a better singer or a better chef? Does that make you a singing realist, a dancing realist? Are there stance independent facts about what makes someone a good or a bad dancer? I mean, I find the idea completely silly. And yet people clearly can make progress on dancing. A person's, even their standard could be, do I like how I'm performing better? It could be entirely contingent on an obviously subjective standard, and you could still make progress with respect to that standard. So this idea that you can't make progress in relative terms, it just strikes me as very bizarre. I think I'm belaboring the point. I hope you all are on the same page with me.
If society is what produces morality, moral progress therefore only makes sense if there's an actual ultimate objective standard we're progressing toward.
This is completely wrong. I mean, note the use of the term actual. That's a misleading modifier. But the idea that you could only make progress according to some objective standard. Why would we think that? So I have a personal set of moral standards. Like, I have my moral values. If society better approximates, living in accord with those values. So laws are passed that are more in line with my moral values. People are more likely to act in accord with my moral values. And then society has made progress relative to my moral standards. Nothing about the concept of morality being relative in any way makes it impossible for there to be progress. So this idea that progress is only possible under objective morality or stance independent morality is a complete myth. There's no conceptual reason why you couldn't have progress relative to one or another stance dependent standards. I don't know where people get this idea. I don't know why people argue this. It's just clearly wrong.
Now, like I said, I genuinely apologize for bringing up such heavy topics, but this is the moral argument. We are going to talk about very immoral things here, unfortunately. So if humans and societies aren't the foundation of morality, because obviously we can't be trusted to be the foundation, what exactly is the foundation for morality? Well, for theists, those who believe in God, the answer is obvious. If there are indeed moral facts and duties that we ought to follow, those moral facts and duties must be grounded in a necessary and unchanging being.
What does it mean for them to be grounded? What does that mean? People talk about moral facts being grounded. And when I've asked for answers to this, I've gotten really weird responses.
Objectively binding. And therefore, if morality is objective, God, a necessary and unchanging being, must exist. And in fact, this is the same answer.
Take this back too.
Grounded in a necessary and unchanging being to be objectively binding. And therefore, if morality...
Binding. What does it mean for a moral fact to be objectively binding? Like if you bind someone, like you might tie up a prisoner or something like that, or you could bind, a bundle of sticks. How is a moral fact binding? It sounds metaphorical. What does that mean? Realists will say stuff like the moral facts are inescapable. So if you put someone inside of like an adamantium prison and they wanted to leave but they couldn't, no matter what they did, that's an inescapable prison. When it comes to stance independent moral facts, to say that they're inescapable, it sounds to me, I wrote it like a kind of allegory like this once. I'll give you the allegory. Imagine you're walking down the street, walking your dog. So I got my dogs over there. Imagine I'm walking down the street, walking my dog, and someone came up to me and they said, "Hey, you can't walk your dogs here." And I was like, "Why not?" And they're like, "Because it's against the rules." I'm like, "What rules?" I'm like, "The rules." Okay, which rules? Well, the rules I've established. They're just saying that there's these rules they've established. Steve's rules. I think Don Loeb has this similar story about there being this list of rules from Steve. Why would you care about these? So I'm like, okay, so you're Steve? And they're like, yeah, I'm Steve. And I say it's against the rules for you to walk your dog here. Now, we could start having a question and answer session here or some kind of dispute here. Or I might say something like, well, what if I don't follow your rules? And they're like, no, my rules apply to everybody. And I'm like, so I can't opt out of the rules. They're like, no, you are subject to these rules whether you want to be or not. Now I might ask, okay, well, what are you going to do if I break the rules? And they're like, oh, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to point out that you're breaking my rules. What would you do at that point? I mean, this person sounds like they're insane. But at that point, if they're not going to do anything, they're not even going to stand in your way. They're not going to impair you or stop you from walking your dogs. You can just go ahead and walk your dogs. And it might even be annoying for them to bother you. So they might just say, I'm not even going to continue following you, saying what you're doing is wrong. I'll just judge you as wrong because what you're doing is wrong. It's against the rules. And they leave. There's no consequences. And so when it comes to objectively binding moral facts, okay, so let's say that there's a bunch of moral facts and they're objectively binding and I ignore them. Then the question is, what happens? What are the consequences of me ignoring them? As far as I can tell, there are no consequences to violating the objectively binding moral facts. So how are they binding? An adamantium prison is binding in the sense that you literally can't get out of it. It's literally inescapable. So these moral facts that are allegedly inescapable, in what sense are they inescapable? I'm subject to them, but being subject to them has no consequences. So what kind of binding is that? It's nonsense. So imagine I went around telling people, I went up to people and I'm like, I got you. You're in my invisible ghost prison. And they just walk right out of it. And I'm like, no, you can't do that. You're in my invisible ghost prison. This is how moral facts bind people. They bind you with an invisible rope. Aha! You're bound with the rope of moral realism. And you're like, I'm bound? How am I bound? This is what the realist moral facts are like. They do nothing. They can do nothing. It's completely ridiculous. What a ridiculous view.
morality is objective, God, a necessary and unchanging being, must exist. And in fact, this is the same answer that many atheist philosophers, such as Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre, concluded. For instance, even if you knew absolutely nothing about Nietzsche, you've probably heard his very famous quote, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him." Now, the thing is, some people use this quote as a victory rallying cry for atheism, as in, we finally did it. With our rationality and science, we have finally killed that superstitious idea of God. The thing is, when Nietzsche penned this phrase, he did so with horror, sorrow, and anxiety. Because this claim that God is dead and we have killed him was never meant to be a victory cry. The point of this quote is that everything we once knew and took for granted, everything we once grounded in the nature of God, can't actually be justified if God doesn't exist. If God is dead, we can't use God to justify morality. And Nietzsche therefore believed that any form of morality that was based on Christian foundations was destined to fall apart. Because after all, if God is dead, the foundation for that morality was gone. To quote Nietzsche directly, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. Remember the example I gave of the Roman Empire. That morality isn't self-evident. Christianity is a system. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Even modern atheists like the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins, he has noted that without God, there is no evil and no good. And so historically, atheists have actually agreed with us. If God
This is a very weak argument. It's the kind of move that William Lane Craig makes, which is to just pick out a handful of atheists and say, there are atheists that agree with us that you need God for morality or moral realism. Why? Because Nietzsche thinks so, and maybe Richard Dawkins thinks so. Okay, I don't know if his characterization of what Nietzsche thinks and why he thinks it is accurate either. But even if we set that aside, even if Nietzsche would agree with what he said here, like with his characterization, and even if Richard Dawkins would, so what? I mean, first of all, Richard Dawkins is not a philosopher and doesn't know very much about this. It doesn't know anything about metaethics, as far as I know. So who cares what he has to say about the matter? And even if you could find like several atheist philosophers that think this way, again, so what? If we want to go by the data on the matter, if you look at the 2020 Phil Paper survey, what is it? 70% of philosophers are atheists, and then 62% are moral realists. I think if you exclude all of the philosophers that responded to the survey that are theists, you still have a slight majority that are moral realists. And so it very well may be the case that a majority of professional philosophers currently working are both atheists and moral realists. It would be quite a stretch to suppose that they think that that's impossible, given that they currently hold that view. And even if it's not a majority, it's a very substantial proportion. It is like the most common position to be both an atheist and a moral realist, at least among contemporary analytic philosophers. So, why quote Richard Dawkins and Friedrich Nietzsche when we have data right now about what contemporary analytic philosophers think? Very few of them are likely to think that moral realism is incompatible with atheism. I would bet if you surveyed analytic philosophers that it would be, I would bet a lot of money that it's under 20%, but it's very likely under 10%, maybe even under 5%. This is not a view that any substantial number of people seriously endorse.
God doesn't exist, objective morality doesn't exist either, which means that morality is effectively just based on one's opinion. It doesn't actually have any bearing on whether or not something is good or bad. However, the thing is,
well, what does that mean to say it has no bearing on whether something is good or bad? I mean,
even though morality doesn't exist either, which means that morality, he has noted that without God, there is no evil and no good. And so historically, atheists have actually agreed with us. If God doesn't exist, objective morality doesn't exist either, which means that...
Well, some atheists may have agreed with you. That's all you've established. So what? Some atheists probably think the earth is flat. Big deal.
Is effectively just based on one's opinion. It doesn't actually have any bearing on whether or not something is good or bad.
I don't know what that means to say it doesn't have bearing on whether something is good or bad.
However, the thing is, even though for the longest time atheists have agreed with us that if God doesn't exist, objective morality can't exist, many modern atheists actually believe in objective morality. So what exactly is their foundation for this objective morality? Well,
okay, cool. I'm gonna have to leave it there. I have an appointment to get to. I'm real sorry about all the interruptions. Oh man, what chaos. I hate when my streams go this way, but I'm glad everybody's here. I'll probably be back either later today or sometime tomorrow to finish up this video. That was a bit hectic. I'm glad you're all here though. Let me pop. I still have a couple minutes, so I'll pop into the comments and have a look at that. Then I'll head out of here. All right. Coffee Spunk, hey, good to see you. Says, I think binding authority boils down to having more reasons to do X, Y, and Z, even if I don't want to. So basically, categorical reason. Yeah, I mean, that's a completely useless type of binding. So having a reason. Well, if the reasons aren't things I care about, then those are pretty useless. Coffee Smug goes on, but obviously that raises further questions, how such authority is grounded or made intelligible. Yeah. Jeremy Gord says, I highly doubt Dawkins said any such thing out of context. Yeah. There's this, remark from Dawkins where he says something like, without God, there would be nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, blah, 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 blah. I doubt it was explicitly intended as some sort of meta-ethical claim, but who knows? Even if we just grant for the sake of argument that Richard Dawkins thinks you can't have objective morality without God, with all respect to Richard Dawkins, who gives a shit? Like, I don't really care about his meta-ethical position. Even if you cited like a specific academic philosopher that works in metaethics, like let's say I find one specialist in metaethics who's an atheist who says you can't have objective morality without God. Okay, so you found a person that thinks a thing that supports your point. And like, so what? All right. Yeah, Mason says, I'm pretty sure Dawkins is making a claim about amoralism of nature, not per se human society. Yeah, my understanding of that remark was that he was basically saying that nature doesn't give a shit. Like, nature doesn't care. Nature is like honey badger. It doesn't care. It doesn't give a shit. So that was, how I interpreted him. I didn't interpret it as being some sort of meta-ethical claim. Coffee says 8 minutes is pretty good for a Lance stream. Real Time says, wow, I'm late. Yeah, and I got to go. So unfortunately, I'm not going to finish this up now. Plintigaff says, this guy also misunderstands Nietzsche. He did say that without the Christian metaphysics, the morals make no sense, but he did think that the death of God, the concept, means a glorious sea to sail, something to be happy about. Yeah, I'm hesitant to offer my own interpretation of Nietzsche because I am not a Nietzsche scholar, but not even close to a Nietzsche scholar. I read some Nietzsche 22 years ago when I was an undergraduate for the first time. In fact, my first philosophy essay ever was on the concept of the Übermensch, and I went totally bananas with it. I read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I read a few other works by Nietzsche. And then I picked up Walter Kaufmann's book, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist. And, Kaufmann was a scholar that did a lot of work to sort of revive Nietzsche's reputation. And it was great. And I got really, really into that stuff. And I saw Nietzsche as as suggesting that as society, with, the theory of evolution and other sorts of scientific breakthroughs and discoveries, our intellectual foundations for maintaining a belief in Christianity were crumbling. And while this led us to these open seas that were tumultuous and scary and a very dark place to be, ultimately something beautiful could be born out of that. He has this quote. What does he say? One must still have enough chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. I think that's the quote. And I always saw him not as a dark pessimist, but as someone that was very much arguing that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And, you take that tunnel in the direction you want to, and you decide what kind of light's going to be on the other end. It's very much a triumphal, positive view, I think. At least that was my interpretation. But I'm not a Nietzsche scholar. So if you are, and that's a completely stupid way to interpret Nietzsche, let me know in the comments. But that's how I interpreted him. I never interpreted him as thinking it's like this horrible, awful, terrible thing to abandon Christianity. Quite the contrary. It looks to me like he's not a big fan, and that he thinks the world would be a whole lot better if we abandon Christianity and create our own values. All right, I think I'll wrap it up there. Everybody, I will be back later. I know I got a lot of people here now, and I wish I could keep going, but I do have other obligations. So I'll wrap it up there. Do go like the channel. I know I'm being very critical of the video, but I really do appreciate and enjoy engagement with people with opposing views. My job is to try to raise public awareness about the defensibility of anti-realist positions. Moral anti-realism is not an evil view. It doesn't entail that you're like okay with baby torture. Anti-realism is just denying certain metaphysical and conceptual claims that academic philosophers make. I don't think that they have much practical implications. I don't think it's really a big deal. I think as a society, we need to work on our shared values and trying to build something better according to our own standards. So maybe that's more in the Nietzschean spirit than I typically discuss. But that's my objective. I do enjoy disagreement with other people. So go check out the channel, give it a like, give it a subscribe if you want to see more of their content. I don't know what else is on the channel. And leave a friendly comment there if you do, even if it's critical. Do like this video, share this video, do all that stuff, and I'll finish this in a part 2. All right, everybody, take care. See you all later.